Okay, so you think Nike makes shoes. You see the swoosh on a pair of Air Max at the mall, flip them over, check the price tag, $150, maybe 200, and somewhere in the back of your mind, you assume that most of that money is going toward the shoe itself. The rubber, the foam, the mesh, the factory workers who stitched it together somewhere in Southeast Asia. Here's the number that should stop you cold. That shoe cost approximately $30 to manufacture and land on American soil, not 30% of the retail price. $30 out of 150, so where does the other 120 go? And more importantly, why are you, a rational adult with real money, perfectly willing to hand it over without a second thought? That's the most interesting economics question in the entire consumer industry, because Nike isn't primarily in the business of making shoes. It figured out, decades before its competitors, that the real money isn't in the rubber or the fabric. It's in something far less tangible and far more valuable. Once you understand how that works, the outsourced manufacturing, the marketing machine, the engineered scarcity, the celebrity ecosystem, you will never look at a sneaker the same way again. This company didn't start with a billion-dollar vision. It started with a $1,000 handshake. In January 1964, Phil Knight, a Stanford MBA and former middle-distance runner, and his old track coach at Oregon, Bill Bowerman, each put in $500 and founded Blue Ribbon Sports. Their entire business model was to import low-cost running shoes from Japan's Onitsuka Tiger and sell them to American athletes who couldn't afford the dominant German brands. Knight sold those early shoes from the trunk of his Plymouth Valiant at track meets while working a day job as a CPA. Bowerman took apart the imported shoes in his garage, experimenting with lighter materials to shave grams off a runner's foot. The break came in 1971 when Onitsuka Tiger tried to cut them out entirely and establish direct American distribution. Rather than fight a losing legal battle, Knight and Bowerman went independent. They needed a new name and a new logo. A local design student named Carolyn Davidson drew what would become the most recognizable mark in the history of consumer goods. They paid her $35. The company launched its own shoe line at the 1972 Olympic trials in Eugene, Oregon. The timing was intentional. Bowerman had also just invented something remarkable. He'd poured liquid urethane rubber into his wife's kitchen waffle iron and discovered that the resulting pattern created extraordinary traction and cushioning underfoot. The waffle sole became Nike's first genuine technological edge. But here's the thing. The waffle sole was a great shoe. It was not what made Nike a $100 billion company. What made Nike that was a business model? One that its founders began building almost immediately, and that most people still don't fully understand today. Here's the biggest secret hiding in plain sight. Nike doesn't own factories, not in any meaningful sense. The company that produces more than 1 billion units of athletic footwear and apparel every year owns virtually no manufacturing infrastructure whatsoever. No assembly lines, no injection mold machines, no sewing floors. The physical act of making a Nike shoe is almost entirely handled by third-party contract manufacturers that Nike doesn't own, doesn't operate, and isn't financially responsible for. This is not an accident. It was a deliberate strategic decision made in the company's earliest years, and it is the single most important structural choice Nike ever made. By outsourcing production entirely to contractors, Nike separated itself from the heavy capital costs of running factories. The machinery, the depreciation, the maintenance, the labor disputes, the regulatory overhead. It shifted all of that risk onto suppliers. Nike's job is to design the product, control the brand, and manage the relationship between design and factory. The factory's job is to execute. If the factory has a problem, it's the factory's problem. Where are these factories? As of fiscal year 2025, Vietnam produces 51% of all Nike footwear. Indonesia accounts for 28%. China handles 17%. The remaining 4% is spread across Thailand, India, Pakistan, and Brazil. Vietnam's dominance isn't arbitrary. The industrial zones around Ho Chi Minh City and the surrounding provinces contain dense ecosystems of textile mills, rubber processors, and chemical foam suppliers. When your shoe factory is surrounded by the companies that make everything that goes into your shoe, internal logistics costs collapse. That efficiency translates directly into the $30 factory gate price. And that $30 number? It includes the factory's own profit margin. The reason a technically complex athletic shoe can be produced for $30 comes down to two forces working together: labor arbitrage and economies of scale. Labor arbitrage is straightforward. Manufacturing wages in Vietnam and Indonesia are a fraction of what they are in the United States or Western Europe. A factory worker in Ho Chi Minh City earns significantly less per hour than a comparable worker in Ohio. That wage differential is the primary driver of the gap between a $30 production cost and what the same shoe would cost to make domestically. but labor is actually only about 15% of a shoe's factory gate cost. The bigger driver is scale. Here's the math that most people miss. When you're producing hundreds of millions of pairs of shoes annually, the fixed costs, the specialized injection molds for the midsole, the computerized knitting programs for the upper, the tooling for every component, get spread over an enormous quantity of units. An injection mold that costs $50,000 to commission produces 1 million midsoles before it wears out. Amortize that 50,000 over a million units and you're adding 5 cents per shoe. At smaller volumes, that same fixed cost is devastating. At Nike's volumes, it effectively disappears. The company also runs its buying power through 15 independent footwear manufacturers operating 97 factories globally. When you're the largest buyer of polyester, rubber, and ethylene vinyl acetate foam on the planet, you negotiate prices that smaller competitors cannot access. That structural cost advantage is almost impossible to close from the outside. Walk this through with real numbers. Take a shoe that retails for $150. Before Nike sees a penny of that, the retailer, whether it's Foot Locker or Dick's or a department store, keeps 50%. That's how retail works. The shoe goes onto the shelf at a wholesale price of $75, and the retailer sells it for $150. The retailer's margin is $75. Nike now has $75 to work with. Of that $75, approximately $40.50 goes toward what Nike calls the landed cost of sales. This breaks down into 3 pieces. First, the actual factory gate cost, roughly $30 for the shoe itself. Then ocean freight, insurance, and port handling fees, which add about $4.50. Then customs import duties on athletic footwear entering the United States, which adds approximately $6. Total landed cost, $40.50. Nike is now left with $34.50. Out of that $34.50, approximately $16.50 goes to corporate operational overhead. Designer salaries in Portland, headquarters rent, regional logistics, technology, legal. Then there's marketing. Nike allocates roughly 10% of net wholesale revenue to what it calls demand creation. On a $75 wholesale price, that's another $7.50 per shoe. After taxes, the net corporate profit on a shoe retailing for $150 is approximately $7.50, 5% of the retail price. That's the margin. On one of the most recognized brands in the world, Nike doesn't get rich on any single shoe. It gets rich because it sells over 900 million units a year. In fiscal year 2025, Nike spent $4.7 billion on demand creation. That figure, $4.7 billion, is the annual revenue of an entire mid-tier athletic brand. Nike spends it on advertising. Let that number sink in for a moment. Then consider what that money is actually buying. It is not buying awareness of the shoe's technical specifications. Nike's marketing campaigns rarely mention midsole density or rubber durometer ratings. That's not what they're selling. What they're selling is a feeling. The 1988 Just Do It campaign didn't show a shoe. It showed an 80-year-old man named Walt Stack jogging across the Golden Gate Bridge and talking about his daily 17-mile run. The product was almost irrelevant. What mattered was the emotional encounter, the sense that Nike is the brand that shows up when you decide to push beyond your limits. This is emotional branding. The theory that purchase decisions are driven not by rational cost-benefit analysis but by identity. When a consumer asks what buying this product says about who they are or who they want to become, Nike has spent $4.7 billion ensuring the answer points to the swoosh. The swoosh becomes a symbol of athletic aspiration, personal discipline, and cultural alignment with elite performance. When you wear it, you're not wearing rubber and foam. You're wearing the signal that you belong in that world. That positioning is what allows Nike to charge $150 for $30 worth of physical material. The premium isn't a market inefficiency. It's the price of the cognitive asset wrapped around the product. In 1984, Nike signed a 23-year-old basketball player from North Carolina to an endorsement deal worth $2.5 million over 5 years. At the time, it was considered an enormous risk. The player hadn't played a single NBA game yet. His name was Michael Jordan. The deal worked because of a mechanism behavioral economists call trust transfer. When a consumer watches Michael Jordan, an athlete of almost supernatural ability, playing in a Nike shoe, his credibility transfers onto the product. The shoe becomes a vehicle for that aspiration. If Michael Jordan trusts this shoe with his career, maybe it's worth trusting. What Nike built on top of that insight became Jordan Brand, an autonomous subsidiary line launched in 1997 that generated $7.3 billion in revenue in fiscal year 2025. Jordan Brand is now the second largest sneaker label in the world, generating billions for a parent company, in part because of a deal signed with a rookie in 1984. Under the perpetual licensing structure, Michael Jordan currently receives an estimated 5% royalty on brand sales. In 2025, that translated to a payout of approximately $275 million to a man who retired from basketball over 20 years ago. That number sounds staggering until you look at the other side of the ledger. At $7+ billion in annual revenue with strong gross margins, Jordan Brand generates well over $1 billion in net profit annually. The $275 million royalty check is simply the cost of doing business. The same logic applies to Cristiano Ronaldo, LeBron James, Serena Williams, and every other athlete in Nike's portfolio. These are not promotional agreements. They are structural pillars of a marketing system built on the transfer of human credibility. Independent brand consultancies currently value the Nike brand itself, not the factories, not the inventory, not the real estate, at approximately $34.4 billion. That number represents the economic value of a curved checkmark. That sounds absurd until you understand what that checkmark actually does. The swoosh logo functions as a cognitive shortcut. In less than a second, it communicates a dense package of signals to any observer who recognizes it. Athletic performance, status, cultural alignment, premium quality. This is what economists call brand equity, and in Nike's case, it functions as what strategists call a moat, a structural competitive advantage that is extraordinarily difficult for any competitor to replicate. You can build a factory, you can hire designers, you can source the same materials from the same suppliers, but you cannot manufacture 40 years of cultural association. You cannot buy the moment when a kid watches Michael Jordan hit a buzzer beater and connects the swoosh on his shoe to everything that moment represents. The result is Veblen good dynamics. Higher prices increase demand because the price itself signals status. A consumer isn't buying a shoe, they're buying a position in a social hierarchy. The physical product can be replicated, the brand cannot. That's why Nike's pricing power is durable in ways that product improvements alone never could be. Nike has learned to weaponize the basic economic principle of supply and demand in ways that would look familiar to luxury goods markets. The SNKRS app, Nike's dedicated platform for limited product releases, operates on a simple premise. Create a product that more people want than exist. Announce a release date, let the tension build. Then release a quantity that guarantees most of the people who want it won't get it. The psychology runs on multiple channels. There's FOMO. A consumer who knows they might not be able to buy something later is more likely to act immediately. There's earned media. A shoe that sells out in 90 seconds becomes a news story at zero cost to Nike. And there's the halo effect across the full catalog. A consumer who can't get a limited Jordan 1 Retro doesn't leave the brand. They redirect to the next closest thing, a general release pair that shares the same design language. The exclusivity at the top of the catalog pulls everything below it upward. Artificial scarcity executed as marketing strategy. The secondary market for Nike's limited releases has grown into a multi-billion-dollar industry that Nike doesn't directly control, but absolutely benefits from WAPs like StockX and GOAT function as stock exchanges for sneakers. Prices are determined by real-time supply and demand, which means a shoe that retailed for $150 can trade on secondary markets for $300, $400s, sometimes $1,000 or more, depending on the release. The resale value of a limited Air Jordan 1 can exceed the original retail price many times over within hours of launch. Nike doesn't see $1 of those secondary market transactions. So why does any of this matter to the company? Because the resale market is, functionally, an outsourced validation engine. Every time a limited shoe resells for 3 times its retail price, it broadcasts that Nike products are worth more than what you paid, and that missing a release has a real financial cost. A consumer paying $150 for a standard Air Force 1 has in the back of their mind the knowledge that limited Nike products trade at multiples of retail. That knowledge makes $150 feel like reasonable value. The secondary market does that work for free. Between a factory in Vietnam and a foot in New York, there is a logistical journey worth examining closely. Raw materials, polyester, rubber, petroleum-based foams are sourced across East Asia and shipped to contract assembly facilities in southern Vietnam and Java. From there, finished shoes are packed into containers and loaded onto ocean cargo vessels at deepwater ports. A single ship crossing the Pacific carries thousands of these boxes. Upon arriving at gateway ports in Los Angeles or Rotterdam, containers move via intermodal rail into massive automated distribution hubs. Nike's European logistics campus in Lockdal, Belgium receives 96% of its inbound containers via inland barges on the Albert Canal, bypassing thousands of road truck journeys annually. In 2023, it launched the H2 Barge 1, the world's first hydrogen-powered zero-emission container ship, cutting carbon dioxide emissions by 2,000 tons per year. The entire system is built around one constraint: The right product in the right place at the right time, with as little idle inventory as possible. Nike's revenue in fiscal year 2025 was approximately $46.3 billion. Footwear accounts for roughly 69% of that total. Apparel, which includes performance training gear and lifestyle sportswear, contributes around 31%. Equipment, bags, balls, training accessories makes up a small remaining fraction. This diversification is structurally important because it means that a downturn in any one product category doesn't destabilize the whole enterprise. Geographically, revenue is balanced across 4 regions: North America, Europe, the Middle East and Africa, Greater China, and Asia Pacific and Latin America. No single regional recession can collapse the top line. The diversity of the product portfolio across running, basketball, football, training, and lifestyle adds another layer. When one category decelerates, another carries momentum. This resilience was built deliberately over decades, and it's one of the primary reasons the enterprise stays profitable through macroeconomic cycles that devastate narrower competitors. In 2020, under then CEO John Donahoe, Nike launched what it called the Consumer Direct Acceleration Strategy. The premise was elegant in its math. When you buy a shoe at Foot Locker, Foot Locker keeps approximately 50% of the retail price. Nike receives the other 50% as wholesale revenue. But if Nike sells you that same shoe directly, through its own website, its app, or its own retail stores, it keeps all of it. The gross margin on a direct-to-consumer sale is roughly double the margin on a wholesale transaction. To accelerate this shift, Nike terminated relationships with approximately 50 major wholesale partners, department stores, regional sporting goods chains, specialty retailers, and significantly reduced supply to Foot Locker. The logic was sound: concentrate distribution through own channels, capture the full margin, and collect first-party consumer data. The execution revealed limits the spreadsheet hadn't modeled. Multi-brand retail stores are discovery environments. A consumer who walks in undecided might encounter a Nike shoe they weren't specifically seeking. By withdrawing from those environments, Nike lost a form of organic marketing that wholesale partners had been providing at zero direct cost. Operating a high-volume e-commerce network also turned out to be expensive. Last-mile shipping, customer acquisition costs, discounting to clear overstock, capital expenditures for owned stores. Nike brand digital sales declined by 20% in fiscal year 2025 as these pressures compounded. In late 2024, the board replaced Donahoe with veteran executive Elliott Hill, who immediately began rebuilding wholesale relationships, including a return to Amazon under a strategy called Win Now. Even the most mathematically compelling business strategy can fail at execution in ways the model didn't predict. Nike has held the top position in global athletic footwear for decades. But the category it operates in is not friendly to complacency. Adidas has matched Nike across football and lifestyle categories and generated its own cultural moments: the Boost midsole, the Yeezy collaboration, the Parley Ocean plastic partnership. Puma has built credibility at the intersection of athletics and fashion. New Balance, for decades dismissed as the shoe of suburban walks, has repositioned into premium heritage running culture. The more structurally significant threat comes from the performance running segment, where On Running, a Swiss company barely a decade old, and Hoka, built on maximalist cushioning philosophy, have both captured significant market share in the premium distance running category. These brands don't need to challenge Nike across all categories. They only need to be better for serious runners, and in some specific sub-markets, they currently are. This competitive pressure is why Nike's annual research and development investment runs between $1.3 billion and $1.9 billion. The Vaporfly and AlphaFly marathon racing platforms, carbon-plated shoe designs that demonstrably improve race times, came out of that investment. Flyknit precision knitting technology came out of it. Nike Air, the pressurized cushioning system that has been in production for nearly 50 years and still generates billions in revenue, came out of it. Without sustained investment in genuine performance innovation, the brand story eventually stops being credible. The marketing can carry a lot of weight, but not infinite weight. The product has to keep delivering. 5 structural risks threaten this business model. The first is supply chain disruption. The extreme concentration of manufacturing in Vietnam and Indonesia means that a single regional crisis, a port shutdown, a labor strike, a geopolitical escalation between the United States and China, can disrupt the flow of finished goods to global retail in ways that compound quickly. Delayed seasonal inventory means markdowns. Markdowns mean margin erosion. The second is rising labor costs. The wage differential that made Southeast Asia attractive in the 1980s is a moving target. As industrial wages in Vietnam and Indonesia rise with economic development, the cost advantage narrows. Relocating manufacturing to lower-cost countries, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Cambodia is possible but requires years of infrastructure development and supply chain reorientation. The third risk is counterfeit proliferation. High-quality counterfeits, so-called superfakes, have become sophisticated enough to fool non-expert buyers. They dilute brand exclusivity, erode perceived quality, and capture revenue that would otherwise flow legitimately through Nike's retail ecosystem. Fourth is fashion cycle risk. Nike's lifestyle business, the Air Force Ones, Dunks, and Blazers that have driven billions in sales, depends on consumer appetite for specific silhouettes. When that appetite shifts, as it appears to be doing right now toward maximalist cushioning and trail aesthetics, Nike can find itself sitting on enormous inventories of suddenly unfashionable shoes. The fifth is macroeconomic sensitivity. A shoe retailing at $150 is a discretionary purchase. In a recession, with rising unemployment and consumer credit stress, it's one of the first things people stop buying. When the economy contracts, Nike must discount to move inventory, which compresses margins precisely when the company can least afford it. Nike's Move to Zero initiative is both a genuine environmental commitment and a shrewd piece of long-term risk management. The target is net zero carbon emissions across the supply chain by 2050. Getting there requires restructuring materials sourcing, factory energy use, and the logistics network. That restructuring costs money now in exchange for avoiding larger costs later. Specifically, carbon taxes, regulatory penalties, and commodity scarcity that are increasingly likely to accompany business as usual. The innovations already in production include Flyknit precision knitting, which reduces material waste 60% compared to traditional cut-and-sew construction. More than 30% of Nike's polyester now comes from recycled sources. The Nike Grind program harvests manufacturing scrap and post-consumer footwear into recycled rubber and foam for new outsoles. The Nike Refurbished program creates a circular retail loop. Worn shoes returned by consumers are refurbished and resold rather than landfilled. These initiatives serve the brand's marketing objectives with younger demographics, who factor environmental credibility into purchase decisions at higher rates than previous generations. Sustainability investment here is simultaneously infrastructure improvement, regulatory risk mitigation, and brand communication. When a financial analyst prices Nike's market capitalization, currently in the range of $50 to $100+ billion depending on the cycle, they are not counting factories. Nike's asset-light model means there are very few factories to count. What they are pricing is a portfolio of intangible assets that are extraordinarily difficult for any competitor to replicate. The first and most significant is brand equity, valued at approximately $34.4 billion. This asset generates consumer demand, justifies premium pricing, and has demonstrated the ability to survive decades of competitive pressure, product failures, and brand controversies. It is the most durable economic moat in the sportswear category. The second is intellectual property. Nike holds over 7,000 patents covering everything from Nike Air pressurized cushioning to Flyknit precision knit structures to circular material recycling systems. These patents are barriers to entry, legal instruments that prevent competitors from replicating specific technologies and force them to develop alternatives. The third is first-party consumer data. Nike's membership programs have accumulated over 220 million active loyalty members. Granular information about purchasing behavior, product preferences, and regional demand patterns that no competitor can access without building the same direct relationship. It allows Nike to forecast demand with an accuracy that brands selling purely through wholesale cannot match. The fourth is global distribution access. The accumulated relationships with thousands of retail partners, the lease arrangements on prime retail real estate, the logistics infrastructure across multiple continents, none of these assets appear on a factory floor. All of them are more valuable than the factories themselves. The answer comes down to one economic insight that applies far beyond Nike. In markets where basic physical needs are already satisfied, where the choice is not between having a shoe and going barefoot, but between this shoe and that one, the purchase decision is no longer about physical utility. It's about cognitive utility. What the product does for your identity, your social positioning, and your sense of belonging in a community that shares your values. Nike figured this out early and built an entire corporate architecture around it. The outsourced manufacturing keeps physical costs low. The billion-dollar marketing machine creates emotional value that dwarfs those costs. The celebrity network transfers human credibility onto the product. The artificial scarcity mechanism maintains cultural exclusivity. The brand equity protects pricing power through economic cycles. The result is a machine that converts $30 of rubber and polyester into a $150 emotional experience, 900 million times a year. Two scenarios for clarity. In an optimistic year, Strong consumer spending, no major supply chain disruptions, fashion trends aligned with Nike's core catalog. A pair of Jordan 1s retailing for $150 generates approximately $750 in net corporate profit. Multiply that across 900 million plus units and the margins look powerful. In a realistic year, the kind Nike is navigating right now. Digital sales contract, inventory piles up, discounts erode margins, and competitors capture market share in running categories where Nike's product story has weakened. Revenue declines. The gap between a good year and a realistic year in this business is measured in billions. The brand holds. It always holds because 4 decades of cultural investment don't evaporate in one weak fiscal year. But the business itself remains exposed to every volatility its marketing tries to make the consumer forget about. So the next time you pick up a Nike shoe and check the price tag, you're not holding a $150 piece of footwear, you're holding $30 of materials and $120 of brand. Built over 50 years, one endorsement deal, and one limited drop at a time. The most valuable part of a Nike shoe isn't the rubber or the fabric, it's the brand in your mind.